as we look at these next steps, I want you to realize that, we're in kind of a deep end here of thinking. I don't want you to get overwhelmed by it. I want you to ask your questions. So whenever you have a question, just feel free to ask it. I will give a few points of time for you to ask a question. Last time, whenever I got to that point, everybody just kind of looked at me. I realized they were all introverts too in the room, so that was one thing last week. But I also realized that some of this stuff you've probably never been exposed to before. You're not even sure what question to ask. It's going to be a little bit like trying to take a sip out of a fire hose. A lot of it's going to go by, but hopefully you get something. One thing I do want you to get is there are answers. And if you ever come to a point where you're struggling with wondering if there are a lot of people way smarter than me that have come up with insights over the generations. This is a collection of people's insights from Aristotle to Aquinas to Augustine and different people. So we're going to hit this first question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever sat? I remember as a kid just kind of looking at the sky and just kind of wondering, where did this all come from? Why are we all here? The answer is going to be found in defining what a test for truth is. So that's the search as we think about this morning. I want you to think about this question. How do we test for truth? And that's what I'm going to be dealing with. So we go back to the question. How do we know, I love this, how do we know that anything exists? How do we know we're not a dream somebody's having, and one day they're going to wake up and we're going to all disappear? Or how do I know that y'all aren't a dream I'm having? A nightmare. No, sorry. And I'm going to wake up and y'all will disappear. I mean, that's really, it's an intriguing thought. And it may be a thought you've never had. Maybe it's a thought you have had. So I want us to realize that many of our movies are wrestling with these issues as well. If you ever watched the movie Inception, and it probably freaked you out, it's probably weird to you, I was fascinated by it because of all the studies I'd done in this kind of thinking. You notice how they take the world and they curl it up, and he could make the world do whatever he wanted to do in his mind because he was living in a dream world, and then he was living in somebody else's dream world, and somehow he was able to travel through dream worlds and gather their secrets, and then he was able to expose them or use them to his advantage or whatever. And so maybe the world is this idea that we're living in somebody else's dream world on our own. The movie Interstellar also dealt with this idea. It dealt with the idea even more so of time bending. I don't know if you saw that movie. On this side, you see him in the spacesuit looking through the bookcase. That's his daughter from years ago, and he's trying to tap Morse code to communicate with her. And this idea of time bending has been around for a while. The movie was that, trying to leave Earth, trying to find another planet on which to live. And so the only way to get to the other side was through a wormhole or get where they needed to go. That really fits with Einstein's theory of relativity, where this idea of time and space, you can somehow bend time, that you can bend space. And in fact, I found this picture, I love this one, where you have the way they described it in the movie is 2 points on a piece of paper. You take the paper and you fold it over, and those 2 points that were over here and over there at far extremes in the universe, all of a sudden you bend it and you're able to travel a short distance and get there in your lifetime. And so that's kind of the idea that they're toying with there. So to take the question a little bit further, how do you know, and I can't remember if this was David Hume, I've been looking for who came up with this illustration, but if you were to close the door, in fact, we closed the door to the room, right? How do we know everything didn't just disappear? And then there's nothing in the parking lot, there's nothing except us in this room that exists, and once we open the door, it all reappears again. I mean, they were toying with that same idea. What's a test for truth? How do you know? And it comes under the area of ontology, the study of being. And so if you ever see that term ontology, it's just a Greek word for being, and it's like, why is there something? It's dealing with what is and reality. The question, if a tree falls in the forest, and there's not somebody around, is there a sound? I mean, that's the reason that you think that's a crazy question. Well, they're asking that question for that same reason. Some of the scientists that I read said, well, yeah, of course there's a sound because there's vibrations, and if you had a recorder there, it would record the sounds, right? Well, how do I know that the recorder is not a figment of my imagination? How do I know the scientist is not a part of a dream I'm having? And so, of course, I love this picture, Did you hear something? I love Dr. George Berkeley. He was an Anglican bishop in the 1600s. He says, yes, it did make a sound. God heard it. Great answer, right? Inception, they're dealing with it. And so the test for truth is this totem. And if they spin it and it keeps spinning, they're in a dream world. If it falls over, they're finally back to reality. So that's their test for truth, right? And then you see Matrix dealing with this test for truth, the red pill and the blue pill. You take the blue pill, you're blissfully ignorant. If you take the red pill, you get to see disturbing truths that may change your reality. So is a test for truth stateability, that I can say what is true? Well, I can say I'm Napoleon, right? I can assume the pose and say, I'm Napoleon. What does that make me? Crazy, but not truthful. That's not a statement of truth. I can say I'm an egg, too. That doesn't make me an egg. So a lot of things are sayable, but they're not necessarily affirmable. Also, logic applies to reality. This is another issue. I know I'm kind of going through a lot of different things, but these things are important as we wrestle with this issue of how do we determine what is true. We have to assume that logic also applies to reality. That when I reason my way through it, that somehow my reasoning makes logical and truthful sense. Aristotle said 2 contradictory statements cannot both be true at the same time and in the same way. Now, in our culture, people say, oh, you just hold contradictory things and you embrace the tension, right? But there's a problem with that statement as well. It doesn't make logical sense. And when I mean by law of reality, one is non-contradiction. You can't hold two things that contradict one another at the same time and in the same way, as Aristotle said. The principle of non-contradiction is this one on the bottom. It is not what it isn't. And at first you hear that and you go, what? What did you just say? A cannot equal non-A. A thing and its opposite can't be true at the same time. There is the principle of the excluded middle. I'm just giving this for sake of kind of comparison. It's A or non-A, or A equals A. It is what it is. And so this idea of non-contradiction is a crucial thought of logic, that things have to make sense. They can't contradict. And in fact, if I say logic doesn't apply to reality, if I make that statement, I'm using logic to say logic doesn't apply to reality, so it's just self-defeating. That statement can't be made. So if somebody tells you logic doesn't apply to reality, does that mean your logic too? I'm just asking, right? And remember, the goal is not to create an argument. The goal is not to put somebody down. The goal is not slam dunk. The goal is to create conversation. And so you want to be able to understand some of these things so that whenever somebody says something, you can actually say something somewhat intelligent and have a response or have a question that makes sense to them, especially where they are. Some of these things in some of those movies, you may think that's really strangeness, that's strange people hold those views or whatever. Well, just know this, if you can enter into their world, into that strangeness, you can begin to talk to them in ways that they understand. I really understood this a lot whenever my mom had dementia. And I found myself trying to correct her understanding of reality. She'd say people are stealing from her, and people weren't stealing from her. It was just her mind playing these games that it happens at that stage and phase of life. And I realized that I had to enter her reality in order to be able to speak to her, which was a scary place to be. But just you think about that. What Paul said about being all things to all people, there are times where you need to understand what somebody else is thinking. If you dismiss it, if you throw it away, if you discard it, if you disrespect it, they're going to sense that and want to have nothing more to do with you and nothing more to do with your questions. because your questions are intended to put them down and make them feel stupid, not feel respected. So it's really important as I talk about these things that we think about these issues, or else we're going to end up turning away the very people that we want to win to Christ. And we think that we're witnessing, and really we're just putting another person down. And we're disrespecting. And I can tell you what, if you feel disrespected, you're not going to want anything to do with that person who's disrespecting you, right? When you enter into somebody else's understanding and where they're struggling, then all of a sudden they're interested. It reminds me of John Trent, who was a counselor. His mom had a bookcase with 3 shelves on it. One shelf had medical books, the next shelf had farming books, and the next shelf had counseling books. And people ask her, "You've got really wide and varied interest. Have you read all these?" "Yes, I have." "Do you understand it?" "Not everything. But I have a son who's a doctor, one who's a farmer, and one who's a counselor. And I want to understand their world." And I think we've got to understand another person's world, and when we be able to talk their language, all of a sudden they're interested in what we have to say about the Lord. So I think it's really important for us to understand these kinds of things, that I'm using logic in order to defeat logic, which means it's self-defeating. That's why I think logic applies to reality. That's why I think the law of non-contradiction holds. Is because if logic applies to reality, then the things of logic hold as well. So, what's a test for truth? What's our totem? What's our red pill that we understand this is what is true? And the thing that, and this was Norman Geisler and others have come up with, I didn't come up with this, is the idea of undeniability. And you'll see that on the chart. You'll see just little code words on the chart on the Buckles Barometer when you get a copy of that. And what I did was I was trying to just give one word here or there to spark your memory, and so then you're able to think through a particular issue. And you're able to have, as I mentioned last time, the cup hooks. If you have, in fact, I just put a rack on our wall for coffee mugs. And before that, they were just coffee mugs on a counter. And when we started putting the coffee mugs, and they're not matching coffee mugs, they're all different ones from traveling. I've got one from Rome, and I've got another one from other places, Tanzania, and other places that I've been, and some from India. And so I found myself putting all the travel mugs in one row, and then all the mugs that were just kind of funny sayings on them in another row, and then other national championship kind of mugs on another. And I found myself arranging them once we had. Before, they were just coffee mugs on a table, all in random order. Most of our thoughts are random thoughts in our heads until we organize them in some way. And in theology, so many people don't have the cup hooks. They don't have the places to hang and be able to organize their thoughts. What I'm hoping with this Buckles Barometer is it gives you this way to visualize exactly where things fit. And so when somebody asks a question, you go, "Oh, they're here," or "They're there." And what you'll find with yourself is when you look at it, you'll go, "Oh, I've got a gap here," or "I've got a gap there." In fact, that's the first thing I've noticed people do when they get it. They see their own gaps. And so this idea of undeniability. Statements are true because they're undeniably true. I can say a lot of things. I'm Napoleon, I'm an egg, but I can't defend it unless it's undeniably true. And so things are sayable, but they aren't necessarily undeniable. Here's another statement of that. What is actually undeniable is true, and then this statement, what is actually unaffirmable, is false. So here's an illustration. Here's 2 words that you'll want to keep an eye on: unaffirmable versus unsayable. If I can say a lot of things, I can't necessarily affirm those things. One can say, "I can't utter a word in English." Whoops, I just said it in English, right? So I can utter a word in English, but I said I can't. And so my statement doesn't measure up. My statement has a fatal flaw, and so it's self-defeating. Therefore, that's the conclusion is what is undeniable is a test for truth, and what is unaffirmable is a test for falsity. So if we can use those definitions while we're wrestling with these issues, and we can talk about the truthfulness of those statements or whatever, but those are going to be some of our basic assumptions as we're moving forward. So there is an undeniable truth. I exist. René Descartes was the one who famously said, I think, therefore I am. This, I think it's cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He said that as a French philosopher because he was wrestling with this same issue. How do we know anything exists? And when you think about it, you might be a dream I'm having, right? But if I say I don't exist, it's like saying I don't speak a word in English. Oh, I just said it in English. If I say I don't exist, I have to exist in order to say I don't exist, and therefore I exist. I've just proven my own existence. I'm undeniably true that I exist. Well, like I said, you may still be a dream I'm having, but I exist. So what do I know about myself? If I think about that, I think I exist. The question is, if I say I don't exist, who said that? I exist in order to say that, therefore I must exist. I got behind a couple of slides. There are also, and that's me and Susan on a train headed to Amsterdam, actually, on one of those bullet trains. That was pretty fun. There can't be an infinite regress of causes. Because what do I know about myself? I'm a limited, finite being. So something caused me to be. I haven't always existed. Since I'm limited, since I'm finite, something had to cause me to be. What have I just done? I've just proven my parents exist. This is actually a picture of my parents. I love the comparison here, the way my dad's looking at my mom and then the way I'm looking at Susan. I thought that was kind of cool. But I've just proven that my parents existed and their parents before them and their parents before them. But you can't just have parents without something being a first cause. Aristotle wrestled with this. It's the idea of a first cause. And the idea is you can't have an infinite regress of causes. So you have a bunch of dominoes. And you think, okay, what caused this domino to fall over? Well, it was this domino. Well, what caused that domino to fall over? Well, that one. Well, what caused that one? Well, that one. I mean, pretty soon, somewhere there's got to be a finger that pushed them, right? There's got to be a first cause. There has to be something that caused all the dominoes to begin to fall. There can't be an infinite regress of causes. And so since there can't be an infinite regress of causes, there must be a first cause. This slide gets a little bit tricky, so stay with me on it. Some limited changing beings exist. Okay, I exist, right? It's undeniable that I exist and that my parents exist and that the whole human race, I've just proven the whole human race. The present existence of every limited changing being is caused by another. No, and this is where the big words come in, right? No potential can actualize itself. If I have an empty glass, it can't fill itself with water. Somebody has to fill it with water. Something outside of that thing that exists has to fill it. Which means that God, if He's the first cause, and you really have three options, it's either God, it's energy, or it's material, evolution, pantheism, or theism. It's one of those things. Well, you look at that and you think, okay, if it's God, He can't change. Because otherwise he'd have potentiality and something would have to finish him or fulfill him or whatever. So he has to be pure actuality. So empty glass, nothing is self-caused. Therefore, something must exist that's actually outside of those things. And self-cause is self-defeating. Something cannot be self-caused. People will say, well, what caused God? Who caused God? Or what caused the beginning of things? Well, you can't. Something had to exist in order for other things to come along. You can't have a caused first cause. And you can't, if there was nothing, imagine nothing. What caused something? Well, something had to always be here. Something has always been here. That's the only answer that you can come up with, because even in Sound of Music, they got it right. Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. You know, when he's singing in the little cupola, you know, their love to one another. I mean, that's true. Nothing comes from nothing. There's something had to always be here. You couldn't have it. There's never seen the uncaused emergence of something. Nothing just boop appeared. And so something has always existed. It's never been observed that something came from nothing. So the first cause had to always exist. Had to be pure actuality. No potentiality. It can't change. And so this first cause must be infinite, necessary, eternal, simple, unchangeable, and one. I mean, that's a lot. And there's a lot to that. I'm not going to go into defense of all those things, but you think about that, it has to have always been here, so infinite. Has to be necessary. It doesn't have anything other than that. Eternal, simple, unchangeable, and one. You look at the scriptures in terms of immutability, it fits the bill on that. You have Hebrews 13:8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, forever, for eternity. That idea. Same thing with what James says. It says, every good and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. That idea of immutability, the idea of oneness, that idea of not changing is powerful in the scriptures about our God. And so that biblical idea fits the logical necessity of this particular focus on a first cause. As I mentioned before, you have three potential things that have always been here. It's either material or evolution, or it's energy like Star Wars, where you have the Force be with you. And this idea that in pantheism, the idea is that we're all tied together. There's just a big energy in the universe, and somehow we're tied in it. There's a disturbance in the Force, and this idea of individuality goes away. And in fact, when you see Star Wars, we have a westernized view of pantheism. Because after, I can't remember which one it is, third one or whatever, you have the Ewoks dancing around, and you have some people that have already died. You have Darth Vader, you have Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you have Yoda. And they're all kind of this apparition, ghostly apparition, and they're kind of all in agreement, and they're kind of cheering what's going on because now they're with the Force. The trouble is that's a Western view, that we still maintain individuality in the afterlife. The reality in pantheism is you become one with the all, and you become nothing, you completely lose your individuality. And so that's something that Western mindset struggles with, and so they kind of took that and played on that in Star Wars idea. If we look at the result, it tells us something about the cause, what caused it to be. And that brings me to this kind of next phase of the Buckles Barometer. And so I want to, before I go there, I want to ask, what questions do you have? I know I've raised some questions. What thoughts do you have? Or what just comments would you like to make about any of the things that we've talked about so far? Yeah. Yeah, God was seen as just kind of a localized deity. And this idea of God being bigger than a geographical location was a foreign idea. You're right. Right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. 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 Yeah. Who created the sun? Who created the moon, the stars? Yes. You're exactly right. And that plays in, that's part of when you think about Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The expanse is declaring the work of hands. We look at creation. The analogia entis is what it's called. Is where this idea of theologically is where this idea that you can look at creation and reason your way to God. Now, Karl Barth really struggled with that whole idea, and there's a lot of people in our day that struggle with that there's any place for reason. And they would say, no, it has to be the revelation of God. Creation is His revelation, but you need His special revelation in order to understand what you're seeing. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. But there's also a struggle with the fact that when I look at my world, I've got to decide if there's a God. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God. It kind of assumes God. It doesn't say, help you think your way through it. Now, there are other places and passages in Scripture where you can go, but when you start at the beginning, you realize, wow, it's just kind of this assumption that you already agree that there is some sort of God that exists. And so how do we reason ourselves to that? How do we think that through? When I was working on my PhD at Southwestern, the thing that I found is that I was in a classroom of PhD students, and this particular classroom, all of them really kind of agreed with Karl Barth and with this idea that you can't reason your way to God. Well, I had 5 classes and the influence of and a lot of books that I read from Norman Geisler, and he was saying, yeah, you can. You can only reason your way to belief that, not to belief in. But it was one of the most kind of fun classes that I had because I kind of threw it out there and then everybody attacked me and jumped on my case about it. And we had a blast wrestling with these issues and talking about what can you know from creation? What can you know as you look at things? Why is it that someone that lives in Irian that hasn't been exposed to anybody on the planet has a concept that the tree has some sort of power beyond itself being a tree, and the sun has a power? Where did they get that idea? It wasn't culture that brought that to them. It was something internal that's I believe we're not a blank slate. I believe that there are things written on our hearts already. And those things Romans 1 talks about is that which is evident about God is evident to them because it's known to them. And so, and it's known by the creation. And we're going to get into a little bit of that when we talk about the idea of how do we know there's a God. That's right. Right. Well, and the thing about that is we're all asking the same questions, right? And it doesn't matter if it's science or philosophy or faith. We're all asking some of these same types of questions. What you find is in our minds, we typically think, I'm interested in spiritual things, but nobody else around me is. The reality is everybody around you is asking the same questions. That's something that we've got to get over. One, we got to get over that we think that they're not interested, because they are. Because everybody has a developed sense of theology, they just don't know what it is. And it's a hodgepodge. Mine was a hodgepodge before I went to seminary, and I realized there were systems of thought, systems of thinking, and I began to wrestle with the different systems of thought as well as the individual issues. And so that's one. The second thing is we need to understand most people will talk about it if they feel it's safe. So you've got to create a safe environment, not a hostile environment when you're talking to folks. That means you set a respectful environment, one that's not quarrelsome, which is exactly what 2 Timothy 2 talks about. I mean, it's amazing. Scripture is very clear about it. Don't argue with people, just in a spirit of kindness and gentleness, talk about these issues. And so I think that when we realize that, this Buckles Barometer becomes more important as we begin to see the cup hooks. That's really what I'm offering, is just the cup hooks, and here's some easy ways to remember what do I need to say next? What do I need to talk about next? On the first phase, all I need to be able to talk about is what? Undeniability. I may not understand everything else. Remember that word. A test for truth, undeniability. And if you remember that, it'll remind you of some of the other arguments for it, and you'll find yourself, in fact, I want to encourage you, I have it kind of at the end of this presentation, but I want to encourage you to get with somebody this week and kind of just talk about some of this and see how much you remember. Because what I found, and I had a brilliant older brother through high school. And so I never felt smart because he was just so smart. He was so brilliant. I always felt a little bit stupid, right? And what I learned is that he had certain processes that he went through. And one of the things is he always talked about what he was learning. And I realized that's a brilliant move from a brilliant guy. And if we talk about what we're learning with someone else, we'll fumble along and we'll not remember exactly. Now, I don't remember how it was said. And then you go back and look at your notes. Well, that whole process helps you as you're processing, how do I say what I'm learning? How do I think it through? That's something we need to teach our kids, by the way. When you're asking them, tell me what you learned in school, you want to know more than just the bare bones. You want to, and if they talk about something, then you can say over dinner or whatever, I've always thought of, I was thinking about what you said about what you learned in school today. I've always been thinking about that. Maybe you haven't, but so you don't want to lie to them. So you tell them something that's truthful. I've never thought about that, but I've always wanted to, or something. But help them to learn to process and verbalize what they're thinking. Because then whenever it comes time to defend themselves in front of one of their friends who's asking them to leave the faith or to embrace something else, they'll have an answer and they've thought it through and they've learned to verbalize it. And so I want to encourage you, take some of these ideas, take the idea of undeniability and just talk about it with your spouse, with a friend, whatever, and say, hey, I want to, and my brother, it didn't matter if I understood half of what he was talking about, to be honest with you, he was just going. And yet he had an ability to take things down and put the cookies on the bottom shelf. The fact that you take that and you've figured out how to take a complex issue and make it more simple in your mind to someone else is huge. I had a professor who said, if you can't take what you're learning and explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it well enough yourself. And so I think that these kind of things, talk to your kids about this. Hey, I learned something in Sunday school. Can I tell you about it? It's undeniability, and they're like, what? You're crazy. But you'll find yourself as you process through this with them, they're going to pick up some things. You're going to learn some things. They're going to begin to ask you questions that you don't have an answer for. That's okay. Just tell them, I can't remember that. Let's go look it up. And you look it up together. You think through it together. It becomes fun learning together about our Lord.